What if the most profound tragedy in American history wasn't just a story of cruelty, but a carefully buried secret, sealed with a vow and lost to time? What truly unfolded on that desolate altar in 1850 Georgia, where a master forced a slave, and a slave, forbidden to love, into a twisted matrimony, only to meet his end the very moment the vows were spoken? Was it a final act of vengeance, a dark ritual finally completed, or did something ancient and slumbering stir within the chapel's walls that day? This is more than a local legend. This is the forbidden wedding of Sarah and Elijah, and what they left behind is not merely a ghost story. It is a curse that still echoes. Stay with us, for the truth has been waiting centuries to finally speak. If you are drawn to the stories that time tried to erase, the truths hidden in the shadows of history, subscribe to The Forgotten Cell and turn on notifications, so you never miss our journey into the unknown. The Black Hollow Plantation was a blight upon the earth, a place where the very air grew thick and still, perched on the rotting fringe of the Georgia marshlands. By the year 1850, its infamy had already seeped into the bones of the nearby towns, not for any wealth of cotton or beauty of its grounds, but for the profound, unnatural silence that clung to it like a shroud. The manor was a specter of its former self, a two-story Greek revival monument to decay, its windows perpetually shuttered, its grandeur crumbling back into the soil. They said the piano in the drawing room hadn't known a living touch in decades, and yet, on nights without a breath of wind, neighbors would sometimes startle at the faint, discordant notes that seemed to drift from nowhere across the barren fields. This kingdom of silence was ruled by Augustus Holloway, a man whose piety was as cold and sharp as a knife's edge. He commanded over 200 acres and 31 human souls, his family Bible serving not as a record of life, but as a ledger of the dead. He offered no warmth, hosted no guests, and his weekly sermons, mandatory for every soul on the property, were fiery diatribes of obedience and wrath, always culminating in a chilling recitation from Psalm 94. The Lord is a God who avenges. O God who avenges, shine forth. And among those souls were Sarah and Elijah. Their names were just an entry in Holloway's ledger, a line of ink and property value. But in the hushed stories that would outlive that ledger, they were everything. Sarah served in the main house, her hands constantly tending to linens and mending tears, her eyes holding a distant, knowing look, as if she were forever seeing something just beyond the shoulder of whoever stood before her. Elijah labored in the fields, his back a map of old wounds, his spirit refusing to be broken. At dusk, he would sing low spirituals, the words a mystery, but the feeling behind them a profound and moving sorrow. They were young, no more than 20, and they dared to love each other in a world built to crush such a feeling. Their connection was a quiet rebellion. Sarah would find a reason to be at the well when Elijah passed by. He once risked everything to leave her a gift, a small pendant carved from oak, a symbol from his mother's homeland whose full meaning was lost to him. It was found, of course. The pendant was burned, and Elijah was whipped before the entire quarters as a lesson. But that night, the stories say, Sarah stood barefoot in the cold marsh for hours, speaking words into the darkness in a language no one could place. An elder named Martha, her words preserved in a 1936 interview, remembered them with eerie clarity. "That Miss Sarah," she said, "she weren't like the rest of us. She see things, talk in her sleep. Said her mama came in dreams and told her blood was going to come down in the chapel. And Elijah, he didn't sleep. Said he heard the Lord talking through the cypress trees. Said he had mighty big plans." That chapel, a small stone building on the western edge of the property, had been locked since Holloway's wife died in childbirth. It was forbidden ground. Yet, Sarah and Elijah were drawn to it, often seen near its moss-eaten walls on the darkest of nights. One child claimed to have seen the faint flicker of candlelight behind its boarded windows. Another swore they heard singing from within, a slow, heavy harmony that was nothing like any hymn they knew. By the summer of 1850, Holloway himself had grown more volatile, his quiet cruelty curdling into something far more sinister and unpredictable. The stage was being set, and the players were moving into place for a tragedy that would stain the land itself. His sermons twisted into darker prophecies, his words laced with a frantic need for purification. He spoke of cleansing his estate, of a spiritual pestilence, invoking biblical plagues with a feverish intensity, and took to sleeping with a loaded pistol tucked beneath his pillow. Some historians speculate he had discovered the secret affection between Sarah and Elijah and saw it as a sin to be purged. But others, tracing the darker threads of this story, believe he feared something else entirely, something his own cruelty had inadvertently nurtured, something ancient that had been called forth by the couple's forbidden union, awakening from its slumber beneath the very foundations of his chapel. A single, surviving entry from his personal journal, unearthed from a private collection, hints at this consuming paranoia. The girl walks with the night. The boy watches me through the corn. They do not fear God. They do not fear me. The altar must be sealed. And then, without warning or reason, he made his shocking announcement. There would be a wedding. Not for any relative. His children were all dead or vanished. No. Augustus Holloway declared that Sarah and Elijah would be joined in holy matrimony, a full Christian ceremony to be held in the long-sealed chapel before the entire plantation. He called it a generous gesture, a gift from a benevolent master, but the announcement was met not with joy, but with a cold, sinking dread that settled over everyone who heard it. Because on that plantation, no one believed for a single moment that Augustus Holloway ever gave anything without planning to take everything in return. The truth of what happened next would lie buried for over a century, waiting for a force of nature to reveal it. In 1973, a vicious storm tore through the remnants of the Black Hollow estate, its fury finally matching the violence of its history. The wind shattered ancient trees and delivered the final blow to the plantation's last standing wall, which collapsed inward with a weary groan. After the tempest passed, a local historian named Evelyn Mercer, a woman who had devoted her life to studying the region's most haunted lore, saw an opportunity. She led a small team of volunteers through the storm-wrecked property, pushing through the overgrown brambles until they found it, not the main house, but the long-lost chapel, its stone walls stubbornly standing beneath a thick blanket of moss, ivy, and thyme. Forcing the door open was like breaking a seal on a tomb. The air inside was suffocating, thick with the smell of wet earth and centuries of decay. Light struggled to pierce the darkness through the boarded windows, leaving the team to navigate with beams of flashlights that cut through the swirling dust. And there, at the head of the tiny chapel, was the altar. It was carved from a single massive piece of dark oak, its surface marred by a deep, violent crack that spoke of more than just age. It was a wound. Compelled by a historian's instinct and a mounting sense of dread, Evelyn and her team carefully pried the damaged altar open. The cavity beneath was not solid earth. It was a hollow space, a secret box. And within it, they found a collection of small, crumbling bones, fragmented, ancient, and terrifyingly human. But what lay beside those bones, nestled in the darkness, was a sight that would forever change the story of Sarah and Elijah, and it was infinitely more chilling. A bundle of correspondence tied with rotting twine and carefully swaddled in brittle linen lay nestled beside the skeletal remains. The parchment was brown and fragile as a dried leaf, the ink faded to a ghostly sepia, smudged in places by the relentless moisture of time. Yet, against all odds, many of the words remained hauntingly legible. They were written in a fractured, inconsistent English, the handwriting shifting with emotion, punctuated by phonetic spellings and strange arcane symbols sketched in the margins. They were the secret letters of Sarah and Elijah, and their tone was a terrifying pendulum swing between tender, desperate devotion and a cryptic, mounting dread. One letter, dated March 2nd, 1850, sent a chill through the researchers. He say we free in heaven, but the dead walk here too. I seen them. Mama come in dreams, her eyes white, her mouth gone. She say don't wait no more. The doors are open. Another, presumably from Elijah's hand, described standing in the endless fields and hearing whispers that rose not from the wind, but from the very soil. Voices calling through the roots, They tell me where to find the old way. They show me how to bleed the ground. Interspersed among these intimate confessions were fragments of something far darker, rhythmic, repetitive strings of words that could only be invocations or prayers. They were a chilling fusion, patterns echoing West African spiritual traditions from the Congo region, but brutally altered, twisted together with stark verses from the Old Testament. This was not just a love story. This was a shared spiritual mission, a ritual pact written in fear and hope. The repeated phrase, "The doors are open," became a focal point of terrified speculation. Was it a metaphor for escape, or did Sarah and Elijah truly believe they had unlocked something ancient and hungry that had been waiting in the shadows of that cursed land? In 1981, a theological anthropologist named Dr. Luther McCall published a bombshell essay that sent shockwaves through academic circles. He argued the bone altar was the heart of a powerful syncretic belief system, a desperate fusion of Christian ritual and surviving African ancestral practices. In McCall's view, this was not merely a memorial, it was a spiritual conduit, a place where unimaginable pain, memory, and fierce intention had coalesced into something potent and alive. He wrote, "Black Hollow was not simply a site of cruelty. It became a crucible. The enslaved took their torment and bent it into something else. Resistance, yes, but also invocation. The marriage he forced upon them was more than symbolic. It may have been a sacrament in a religion Augustus Holloway never understood and feared too late." The official response was swift and silencing. The town council refused to fund any further excavation. The haunting letters were quietly transferred to a dusty local archive, and the bones, never officially analyzed, were ordered to be reinterred by the county under a veil of secrecy. Evelyn Mercer, the historian who had dared to look, resigned shortly afterward. The official reason was anonymous threats and the sudden mysterious illness of her assistant, the one who had first handled the remains. But you cannot bury a truth that wants to be found. The legend of the bone altar refused to die. It spread through whispers, and soon, locals began to leave quiet offerings at the edge of the chapel ruins. Wildflowers, bundles of feathers, small, carefully carved dolls. And sometimes, these gifts would be gone by the next morning. And sometimes, they would be replaced with things no one could explain. A knot of black hair, a river stone painted with a symbol that matched those in the margins of the letters. The land was still speaking, and it was asking for something. Shards of pottery marked with unknown symbols, or birds found dead with petals carefully placed in their beaks. The letters had been found, but their true meaning remained a locked door, and the keys were these unsettling offerings. The stage was now set for the final terrible act, March 12th, 1850. The morning air over Black Hollow was brittle and cold, as if the very wind had fled in anticipation of what was to come. A pale, dead mist clung to the fields, shrouding the little stone chapel in a silence so profound it felt like a held breath. This was the day Augustus Holloway had decreed a celebration, a wedding he called a union not of privilege but of divine grace. He spoke of divine inspiration, a gesture from a god of order. But his words were hollow, and every soul on the property heard the lie echo in the stillness. The chapel, forced open after years of neglect, was a tomb. Dust lay thick on the pews, like fallen snow. The stained glass windows were webbed with cracks, casting fractured, sickly light onto the stone floor. The altar, scrubbed raw with lye and salt, still reeked of damp rot. And something else, something coppery and sour that seemed to seep from the stone itself. The procession to that altar was a waking nightmare. Sarah was made to wear a dress of white, fashioned from repurposed burial linens, her hair bound tightly, her gaze cast down but burning with a fierce, unreadable intensity. Elijah stood tall and unbent, barefoot on the cold stone, wearing a tattered coat that had once belonged to Holloway's dead son. The congregation was not one of guests, but of the enslaved, forced into rigid, silent rows and flanked by overseers with rifles held at the ready. Holloway stood before them, a Bible in his hand, his voice a flat, detached monotone. He read from Corinthians on love and obedience, but he emphasized only one thing: submission. Then he paused, his eyes locking onto Sarah. "Do you take this, man?" he asked, his words dripping with a false sacrament. "Before God and your master?" Her voice was clear, a bell in the silence. "Yes." He turned to Elijah, whose eyes were fixed not on Holloway's face, but on his throat. The man gave a single sharp nod. What happened next shattered the reality of everyone present, and the accounts would fracture into a dozen different nightmares. Some said Sarah collapsed as if her strings had been cut. Others swore the walls themselves began to weep thick, dark blood. Several testified to a wind, a sudden violent gust that tore the nailed-shut windows open and snuffed out every candle, plunging the chapel into a gloom lit only by that bloody, fractured light. But the one detail that remained consistent across 7 separate oral testimonies was the sound, a scream, not human, not animal, a deep roaring shriek that seemed to tear up from the very foundations beneath their feet. Holloway dropped his Bible, and Elijah moved. In one version, he produced a blade, a rusted, sharpened piece of metal hidden in his sleeve, and plunged it into Holloway's chest, soaking the sanctified altar in his master's blood. In another, Holloway simply burst into flames, a fire that consumed only him, leaving the wood around him untouched. One elderly witness, her voice captured in a 1914 interview, claimed she saw a shadow rise from behind Sarah. Stretching along the wall, a form shaped like a man with great antlers and eyes of burning coal. The chaos was swift and absolute. When it subsided, 3 overseers were found dead outside the chapel, their throats slit with an impossible precision. The rest had fled in blind terror into the marsh, abandoning the plantation for good. By sundown, Black Hollow was a ghost estate. Holloway's body was never recovered. All that remained was a single, severed hand, charred black, found near the chapel steps. Sarah and Elijah were simply gone. In the weeks that followed, rumors became legend. Some said the couple had escaped north to freedom. Others whispered they had never left at all, that their spirits were now bound to the land by the ritual that had taken place, and they could be seen at the forest's edge at dusk, holding hands, their eyes glowing with a soft, eerie light. The plantation was left to die. The land itself seemed to turn against any who would claim it. Crops withered, animals refused to graze, and travelers who ventured too close would return hours or days later, silent, confused, and missing pieces of their memory. A final, stark entry in the Holloway family journal, written by a distant relative, reads, "They married in blood. He died by his own altar. The ground will not forget." And it didn't. The ruins of Black Hollow were slowly consumed by the hungry earth, swallowed by vines and silence. By the turn of the 20th century, it was a place of pure superstition. Children dared each other to walk the overgrown path to the chapel door, but not a single one ever reached it. Something always stopped them. An inexplicable cold that seized the lungs. A voice, clear as a bell, calling a name from the depths of the trees. Or the sudden, skin-crawling certainty of being watched by something that meant more than just harm. By 1912, the outside world had largely turned its back on the place, leaving it to the folklorists and the foolhardy. One such fool was Josiah Blake, a student from Savannah who fancied himself a writer of Southern Gothic tales. He arrived with a notebook in one hand and a revolver in the other, determined to spend a single night within the ruins to mine their secrets for a story. He never returned. 3 days later, a search party found his journal beneath the chapel's collapsed roof. Its final pages were a waterlogged ruin, but one sentence stood out, scrawled in a frantic hand. "They stand at the altar still, hand in hand, their mouths stitched shut." Josiah Blake's body was never recovered. The disappearances became a pattern, a dark ritual repeating itself across the decades. In 1948, a newly engaged couple from Macon, cheerful and skeptical of local superstition, visited Black Hollow on a dare. Their car was found a week later, parked neatly at the tree line, keys still in the ignition. Inside were fresh flowers, a wedding dress in its box, and a single folded note that read, "We'll be married where they were." They were never seen again. The stories that seeped out from Burke County grew more disturbing with each passing year. Residents reported shadows that moved against the sun, footprints appearing in dew-covered grass with no source, and the faint, chilling sound of lullabies hummed in a language no one could place. But the most consistent and most terrifying were the sightings of the two figures, a woman in a white dress and a man in a torn coat, standing silent and still in the low fog just beyond the chapel ruins. Some felt a wave of profound sorrow wash over them at the sight. Others were struck by a pure, undiluted malevolence. A theory finally emerged in the late 1960s, published in an obscure academic journal by Dr. Calvin Root, a professor of folklore. He called it the lover's curse. He proposed that Sarah and Elijah had not simply vanished. They had enacted a blood-binding ritual, an act of magic so potent it tethered their souls eternally to the site of their trauma. In Root's view, their bond, forged in pain and sealed by a terrible sacrifice, had created a supernatural echo, a loop of unresolved energy that could warp the very world around it. He wrote, "What we call hauntings are not always the product of a violent death, but of an unfinished communion. Their denied union, defiant in the face of slavery and death, had become a conduit for something far more ancient than love or vengeance." His peers dismissed him, but in the decades that followed, those who ventured near Black Hollow spoke of being ambushed by powerful alien emotions, a crushing longing, a bottomless dread, an overwhelming grief that had no source in their own lives. Some were haunted for days by dreams of a chapel with burning walls and a man and a woman standing before an altar as a river of blood flowed between their feet. In 1992, a team of amateur paranormal investigators set up motion-activated cameras around the chapel. Their full footage was never released, but a single grainy still frame was leaked to an underground magazine. It showed two distinct silhouettes, holding hands, standing before the crumbling altar. No one had entered the chapel that night. The county's response was to finally erect a rusted chain-link fence around the property and nail a no trespassing sign to a nearby tree. It did little to deter the curious. People still come. They come seeking answers, and they leave with questions they are too afraid to ever speak aloud. In the spring of 2006, a documentary filmmaker named Malcolm Tierney arrived in Burke County with a full camera crew, archival maps, and a singular, burning obsession to unearth the truth of Black Hollow. He had spent a decade piecing together obscure local legends and forgotten slave narratives, all of which pointed to the story of Sarah and Elijah. He was convinced something monumental had happened there, something deliberately scrubbed from the history books. Locals warned him. A retired sheriff stopped by his motel and offered a simple, chilling piece of advice. "You won't hear birds out there. That's how you'll know you're close." They laughed it off. The first night was uneventful, just cold air and electronic static. On the second night, their guide swore he saw figures moving along the tree line, though no one else could confirm it. But on the third night, everything changed. At 2:43 a.m., Malcolm began recording a solo segment inside the chapel ruins. In the raw footage later recovered, he appears calm at first, reading aloud from one of Sarah's letters. But as he reaches the line, "The doors are open now," his voice falters. He pauses, turns slowly, and whispers, "Did you hear that?" The camera drops. The rest is darkness and chaos. The audio is a nightmare collage. Footsteps crunching on leaves, Malcolm's ragged, terrified breathing, a low, droning hum that seems to vibrate through the speaker. And then a whisper, female, clear, and ice-cold. He came back. Malcolm Tierney never returned to the motel. His van was found 2 days later, parked at the edge of the property, its windows fogged from the inside. The engine was dead. On the passenger seat sat a bouquet of wilted white lilies and a single Polaroid photograph. The photo was of the chapel's altar, but it wasn't ruined. It was pristine, clean, as if waiting for a ceremony to begin. The footage was deemed unusable and locked away. The surviving crew members refused all interviews, bound by trauma and non-disclosure agreements. Tierney's disappearance became just another footnote, another truth swallowed by the legend. But something new was added to the echo. Hikers now report hearing a man's voice in the woods, reading aloud from a letter no one can find. At dusk, visitors have seen a vintage camcorder lying on the chapel steps, but it vanishes when approached. And more unsettling still, some claim the figures have changed. They no longer see just two. They see a woman in white, a man in a tattered coat, and a third figure standing behind them, peering out from behind the lens of a camera. The ground remembers, the marsh does not forgive, and the chapel, though rotted and collapsed, still marks the site of something profoundly unholy. So what truly happened to Sarah and Elijah? Did they become martyrs of a love so powerful it rewrote the laws of life and death upon the land? Or did they, in their desperation, open a door to something far older than love? Something that still waits beneath the surface, hungering for stories to repeat themselves. No graves were ever found. No death certificates were ever filed. There are only names whispered in fear, and vows that were never, ever broken. What began as a forbidden wedding has become an echo through time, a place where the silence itself has learned how to scream. And here on the Forgotten Cell, we listen.